diverse learners. As you may be aware, you may have come across a particular type of planning in schools that is one Queensland school system's response to the Australian curriculum. So I'll let you have a read of this here, and I want you to think about, what have you heard teachers say about these materials, and how do you feel as a professional using these materials? So as you can see here, it has been made very clear by the Department of Education that these particular plans are seen as being something that could be added to, adapted and modified by teachers to suit the diversity of school contexts and to meet the students' needs and interests. So this means you need to be a highly skilled curriculum worker, and I want you to really think about the structure and ways in which those plans are put together and what that might mean if you've got a classroom that is quite diverse and more and more increasingly likely. So what I'd like to focus on very briefly are students with reading difficulties, but in particular I want to focus on students who have English as an additional language or dialect. So I know that you've studied learners with EALD in a particular unit, but my purpose here is to think about these learners in the context of English curriculum and what their particular needs might be. So first and foremost, these students that I'm talking about here are not students with a disability or difficulty, but they're students who are tackling a great challenge that arises from perhaps some misalignment between their first language and the dialect or language which is valorised and prioritised in Australian schools, standard Australian English. So these students are learning English, the language. They are learning through or in English, so learning other subject knowledge in English, and they're also learning about English in subject English. So quite clever if you ask me. But how do you actually cater for these students? So some general strategies involve things like additional time and support, along with informed teaching that explicitly addresses their language needs and assessments that take into account their developing language proficiency. Now that sounds quite easy, doesn't it? But what is this developing language proficiency that you will need to support? Academic language in particular. Now let's talk a little bit about this, and again I acknowledge this may be a reminder, but academic language is the ability to deal with a range of written materials beyond basic communication skills. Okay, basic reading abilities and skills with oral language. So reflecting on language, the meta-linguistics, so the words that we use to talk about language, grasp of conventions of diverse textual communities, and textual communities consist of readers who use text for their own purposes. The EALD learners in Australian schools may be speakers of Aboriginal English or speakers of World Englishes, or students who have successive biliterates, so they're already highly literate in a language one or a first language. They may be becoming literate for the first time in English, or low literate learners becoming literate for the first time in English as a learner with EAL at a later stage than their peers. And this is important to understand, that there are different impacts for these different learners. So understanding a little bit about Indigenous children and young people who have English as an additional language. Okay, there is an Aboriginal English. Okay, there are Creoles, there are traditional languages, and of course there are young Indigenous people speaking standard Australian English and foreign languages. So it's really important that we get to know our students and understand their literacy histories. What language and literacy skills do they bring to the classroom? So, if we are focusing on learners who have English as an additional language and dialect, then we really need to know what the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority offer as resources. And they offer a number of resources, and now would be a really great time to go and refresh your memory about what those resources are. Basically, the EALD learning progression includes broad descriptions of the characteristics of learner groups at each of the 4 phases of English language learning. Now, of course, students can be any age in any of the language learning phases, and we have beginning English, emerging English, developing English, and consolidating English. And knowing your student's background is really important in determining what phase they are in. So you can manipulate the way in which you read the progression, and so you can view by phase or language mode. And it's really all by year level as well, I think. It's really, or groups of year levels. It's really important that you are able to navigate these resources because you will need to think about catering for diverse language learners in your unit planning. Okay, there's an example of the EALD Overview Advice for Teachers, which has excellent teaching strategies, which can be quite specific. And something that I haven't included here, and when you go to have a look at the resources online, there are also documents where you can look at the Australian English curriculum descriptors, and there are EALD strategies which align with those descriptors. And there's actually documents for each of the different learning areas which you can access for that kind of level of support and resources.